A lot of people ask me, it's probably the number one question that I get when we're not talking the specifics of dog training and the veterans with Project Delta. They ask me, what made you decide you wanted to do this? I didn't really know at the time exactly how my father would play a role in that. Having a husband, children in the military, seeing transitional holes, but also having a great love for the dog. At the time, they really weren't relevant together. Project Delta came into play after, it was strange, but it was literally a news piece on TV where another organization was being interviewed from the veteran perspective. And it caught my attention, and I realized that I was able to kind of put together a lot of thoughts that I had been having about our veterans, the current status of the military, but then also these amazing rescue and shelter dogs that I had become introduced to during my volunteer work with Animal Humane Society here in Minnesota, as well as various rescues that I had gotten to know. Fast forward, and you've got a nonprofit occurring here with the help of a lot of amazing people that we started and we formulated, partially as a family organization, but also just incredible mentors that have come along the way. It took me years into it to really understand that I really knew very little about the effects of the diagnoses that I was supposedly supporting in these veterans. PTSD, traumatic brain injury, military sexual trauma. Those were the blanket diagnoses for anxiety, depression, family trauma. The more and more veterans that I was introduced to, the more that I met, the more that engaged with the program, it became very clear that there was, like the dogs, there was a foundation. There was a foundation of men and women that had suffered extreme atrocities as a result of combat, not even combat, but just being involved with the military. Everybody thinks that you have to be on the front lines of the military to suffer these things. I learned very quickly that that was not the case. I also learned that masking these diagnoses came alcoholism, drug dependency. Those are just a few. As you peel away the layers, you begin to learn that many of these men and women had and have a lot of family trauma prior to ever entering it. But really one of the main things was masking with chemicals. Again, the more and more I journaled it, the more conversations that I had, the more teams that came into play, the more people that were brought into the organization, mental health supporters. It was clear that despite the experiences that may have been very, very different in their time in the military, the foundation of issues was very much the same. That's when I started to really do a deep dive into my father. Robert Warrett was a United States Marine during World War II. I knew very little growing up of his time in the service. He was your classic World War II veteran. It was not talked about. There was no signs of it around the house, meaning There were no pictures. There were no books. There were no reference whatsoever in his time. There were no conversations. And if you did, it was squashed immediately. The only frame of reference that I, as a child, had to his time in the military was an Eagle Globe and Anchor that was tattooed on his arm. As a child, I can remember many times touching that. And he never really pulled away. He never said anything about it. It was a really crappy tattoo, only to learn that it was, again, kind of a classic military thing. In a brief time where they weren't actively engaged in warfare, he and his unit buddies went out, got drunk, and got tattoos. So not really knowing much, basically not knowing anything about my dad's time in the military, had I known, it probably would have explained what growing up with him was like. He was a stunningly good-looking man. I'm the baby of 8 children. Most of my siblings being significantly older than me. So the majority of my time living at home was as an only child. Again, had I had some reference to his life as a Marine, World War II, the Pacific Islands, as I grew older, I would have had a better understanding of who he became as a man. My dad was a brutal alcoholic. At the time, until I was much older, I had no idea why. I didn't even have the understanding to put the term alcoholic on him. I just knew that he spent the majority of his time when he wasn't working drinking. Anybody that has alcoholism in their family knows that it takes on many forms. You have your happy drunk, you have your person that drinks to pass out, you have the manipulative drunk, and then you have the asshole drunk. I can go back to memories to being 7 years old. I'm sure there's more, but that time frame, probably as I was, able to process things a little bit better, that's when I started to really understand what was going on. He drank at different levels. There was the man who, I honestly don't remember if he just left at a certain point during the day. Oftentimes it was like afternoon. And when he came home, somewhat dictated what I was going to experience. Because when he came home dictated how long he'd been gone and somewhat dictated what he would have been drinking. There was the man that would drink beer, lots of it. And he would make his way home, and then it began. And his mode of action was an endless, confrontational screaming. Screaming primarily when I was younger at my mom. There were times when I'd be coming home from school, elementary school through junior high. I went to a Catholic school that was about 6 blocks away, and we walked. So coming home up the street I lived on, I could be 2 blocks away, and I shit you not, I could hear him. I could hear him screaming, yelling, berating. I heard language at that age that most people don't hear. Most kids don't hear until they're well into their junior high school age. And it was the same thing every time. There was no reference to the war. There was no reference to his experiences. It was just a berating, endless berating of screaming. And he didn't acknowledge me, or initially he didn't turn it on to me. It was just my mom. And rarely did she ever say anything back, because I think she learned that maybe he would tire. His voice would literally get hoarse at times. My escape was to go upstairs to my room and just shut the doors. He could scream and yell about her cooking. There was no rhyme or reason to it. And I can still hear his voice. It could be 2 hours, or it could be 6 hours. Constant. Then there were the times where I didn't figure this out until I was older, where he would come home very late. I have no idea how he navigated it, how he was able to drive in those conditions. And that's another story. Where I learned later on that he was drinking what they call Boilermakers, beer in a shot. He didn't scream as much then, because he was so drunk that standing up took effort. Those were the after bar times, and that's when I do remember it was my first experience with having to be a child in this situation that had to protect my mom and my home. Because Boilermakers for Dad meant the stove might not be shut off, the cigarette might not be put out, least of all, the lights be shut off, the TV be shut off. One of the things he commonly bitched about and screamed about was my mom's cooking. And Boilermakers were really interesting because some of the crap that he put together that he would actually eat under those circumstances were unbelievable. But I never left that out. I always made sure that it was put away, and he never even knew. The house that I grew up in, when you walked in the door, it had a huge wooden banister that went upstairs. And when you sat on the stairs at a particular stair, you could see through the dowels into the kitchen. And Dad had a place at the table. He was at the front of the table, and it faced the door going out into the backyard. That's where he sat. Nobody ever sat there. That was his spot. And I would watch him. 7 years old, I would sit there. And I would watch because I wanted to give my mom the chance to stay asleep. I never knew if she was awake. If she was, I didn't know it. I never went in there. Never went into her room, so I sat on the stairs and I waited, and I'd hear him grumbling and rumbling. And I can still see the position that he took with his legs crossed. Eating, grumbling, and then stumbling out and then into the living room. And I could smell the cigarette burning. So I knew when he was drinking Boilermakers, when he was in that condition, that he would fall asleep quickly. So it gave me an opportunity to go downstairs, clean up the kitchen, make sure the stove was off, make sure if there was a cigarette going, put that out, shut that light off, peek around the corner, and he was always in the same position. Turn off the TV, put out that cigarette, grab a blanket, throw it over him like an Afghan. Remember, my grandma had made Afghans and they were there. And that's when I could go upstairs and go to bed. And then get up a few hours later and go to school. I had an older brother, Bill, who was 5 years older than me. And I know he was living through much of this, but being that he was older and got his license, he was able to, out of self-preservation. All of my siblings had ways of dealing with all of this. And I can remember him being in the house too. But what's interesting is it never occurred to me during all of this to even see, are you awake? Are you getting this? Are you hearing this? But knowing now, going through that at my age versus going through it at his age, we all do things very differently. And I know that it affected all of my siblings much the same, but also differently. And again, being so much younger than any of them, I didn't even know how to ask questions. I didn't, and they did their best, to get me out of those situations as much as they knew how to do. And again, I never knew what his personal turmoil was. All I saw was a man who who abused alcohol, and I never knew what I was going to get from day to day, whether he was going to lay hands on her. I only remember at one time. And that's when I knew that something was seriously wrong. I had said earlier that I went to a Catholic school. As I grew up and started dissecting all of this and delving into this, I realized that the school and the church was responsible for, or partially responsible for, saving me. I don't have any of those. I don't have any of that Catholic drama. I don't have any weird experiences. I just know that they silently were aware, now I see it, of what I was going to go home to. And they allowed me a little bit more normal for as long as they could, because things were different then. You didn't, as a teacher, as a person, you know, with any type of authority or anything, you didn't intervene. You didn't step into those situations. But I can remember nearly every day I was allowed to stay after school. I was allowed to rearrange desks, and I was allowed to correct papers, and I was allowed to work in the office at the school, and I was allowed I was involved in so many different things and asked by the teachers and the nuns and the directors of music and this and that to be involved in, and I have to believe that a lot of that had to do with giving me reason to not have to be there. And now I look back on it and think, with what they had and the way they could handle things, those were some pretty amazing people. Because of those influences and those opportunities, it gave me strength and a reality that there were a lot of really good people out there that saw this for what it was, and in their way they protected me as best they could. As myself and all of my siblings grew up, they got married. My siblings got married. They had children. We would all get together, and it was inevitable. We sat down and we talked about, almost sometimes in a joking way, we would talk about the same stories over and over again. We would talk about the issues with my dad, but also, you know, the role my mom played in it, the codependent, the enabler, but we were all enabling it. We knew that there was a problem. And one day, by the grace of God, between my sister and honestly my sister-in-laws who had lost parents, actually became angry with us and said, "What's the matter with you people? We've lost our parents or a parent, and you have a chance to regain a parent. Are you going to just sit back and continue this?" Because mind you, it got to the point where his drinking escalated and elevated to a point where he lost his job after, I believe it was 38 years with the railroad. That was a very common thing in the town that we grew up in. A lot of military people came back from World War II and they spent their time with the railroad, which kind of fostered that way of life and that drinking and everything. As I grew up, the onus fell on me to deal with the repercussions of my dad's drinking, totaling cars, having to be pulled out of school events to go and literally pick him up in a town an hour and a half to 2 hours away. It was ridiculous. I was barely 19 and moved away. I wanted out of that. I didn't want to deal with that. I begged my mother to come with me, to leave. And so again, we as siblings all came together and said enough is enough. So I believe it was at age 67, after an intervention, working with some incredible support people, chemmed up people, we as a family came together and said, no more. And here's our non-negotiables. It was his opportunity to hear from us that we were done. My dad had that ability. If he made his mind up to do something, he was going to do it. And he did. He entered treatment. And I think the beginning, now I see it, the beginning of the healing between the two of us, my dad and I, was that he agreed to treatment, but he was going to come to the Twin Cities because I was here. And I started to see that glimmer of hope in a relationship between the two of us, because I was able to, even though we couldn't see him at all, I could do his laundry, so I could pick it up and I'd get a glimpse and a hug from him. And he did it. In February of 1990, he went through treatment and he never had another drop. A lot of people would think, happy ending. Yay. But the demons that encapsulated him as to why he drank were never truly addressed. So he continued to live with those demons just as a man that didn't consume alcohol anymore. And that, as I've learned and researched, is a very common thing for those in the military, and now I'm learning through law enforcement and first responder world in particular, because those are the demographics that we work with in Project Delta. They do. And those that are truly successful in their recovery, they peel away the layers and they address the layers which created the alcoholism in the first place. Why they chose alcohol or other chemicals to mask, in the case of the military, many of the horrors that they experienced. That has taken me a long time to understand. And every step of the way in the journey of understanding combat, non-combat related issues with all of these demographics, if I only knew then what I know now, I know that I could have helped this man so much more. And part of that was understanding what he actually experienced. And I didn't, like I said, I didn't know. And my siblings, the men in our family, knew bits and pieces. Every once in a while, he would begin to share. And as he got older and a little bit more comfortable, and he was sober, he would give little bits and pieces, tiny little bits and pieces, my husband included. He would share little bits because Len, being in the military, they had a commonality And just when you thought you were getting to that point where he was going to share, he'd shut down. In 2008, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Prior to that, he had esophageal cancer, which he successfully navigated for 4 years. But then the lung cancer, he just said he didn't want to treat it. So it was a very short window of time that he lived, and I cared for him along with the rest of my siblings. But that's when some of the information came out. And it didn't necessarily come out as a result of him sharing stories. It came out in physical things. He wanted his medals to go to one of his sons. He wanted a weapon that he had somehow been able to bring back from World War II to go to one of my other siblings. He had his Marine Corps blanket. He had his book. And he had a lot of paperwork. And it wasn't until after he passed away when I was able to look at that and see what he had been subjected to. The Pacific Islands, Tarawa, Gilbert Island, Saipan, Tinian, Okinawa. He was a Bronze Star recipient. He was a Purple Heart recipient. The Bronze Star for gallantry in action. And then realizing and researching these places and what he had done and experienced as a 19-year-old kid. I get it now. And despite all of this, and years and years and years of living that over and over again, he ended the one thing that masked it, or didn't. So, yes, this is why it is so important to honor these men and women that have served their country, that have gone through these atrocities, that have done the unspeakable, seen the unspeakable, participated in the unspeakable, and there wasn't, for them, ways to cope with it, and there wasn't ways, they didn't even have medical terms for what the aftermath of all of that was. But we know now. We know how the effects of war, whether it's war against our country or war within our country, when you're speaking on behalf of law enforcement and first responders, we know now we can do better. And we can help these men and women because they don't deserve to live in the turmoil that my dad lived in. I don't want, we in Project Delta don't want families. We don't want the children of these men and women to have to experience what so many of us did, because we didn't know, but we know now. And so we can help we can support. We've got endless opportunities to make right and to assist the men and women so that they don't have to spend the rest of their life chasing these demons, masking their experiences with chemicals that are only going to serve as a catalyst to lose everything. But it's not just for them, but for their families, to offer them hope, to offer them healing, to offer them purpose, to find a new way to navigate through it. And that's where Project Delta can deliver a small piece. Not everyone is in a position to enter our program to utilize the dog as their purpose and their tool of healing. Not everybody's ready at the same time, but we have the chance to do better. With our military, it's a very reactive approach. And every day we're learning more. With our law enforcement and first responders, we can take a proactive approach. It's our job and our desire to learn more and more about the mental health aspect of doing these jobs, being put in these situations, to prevent it escalating to a point where our services are even needed. By simply reaching out to us, that's your first step. It's your first opportunity to have the discussions. By reaching out to us, it doesn't have to be looked at as a sign of weakness, but to gain understanding, to gain perspective, and to learn about an option that very well could be the process that saves your life and saves your family's life. These dogs are nothing short of a miracle, and they have a story too. But their unconditional willingness to be a lifeline towards a greater good and a greater life for you will allow you to write your own path. On behalf of Project Delta and everyone that collaborates with us, know that we're here to support you and we're here to get you on that journey.